Welcome to the first ever Cosmic Tape Music Club podcast. This is episode number 1 with your hosts, the Galaxy Electric. I'm Jacqueline.
I am Augustus, and today's episode is about Peter Zinovieff.
Awesome. We are talking about Peter Zinovieff today, and you should know that if you're in the group, if you've been just kind of spying the group a little bit, maybe you haven't picked up on it, but we like to focus on one person per month. This month is Peter Zinovieff. And it's kind of an interesting choice because while he is considered a tape music leader in the British, electronic music history books, he's more of a computer music innovator. So it's going to be interesting to talk today about how he influenced the tape music scene and early synthesizer use, but also is so much more than that, which is not, stuff we usually cover in the group. So tying all those threads together is really fun.
And it almost seemed as an accident that he influenced the tape music scene, really, because he didn't set out to do that, right?
Yeah, I would say that that's true. It was sort of like a byproduct of the times, maybe even. So I guess speaking of the times, let's talk about, who Peter Zinovieff is and when he was born and all that fun biographical stuff that I find really interesting in terms of the story of the person and why they, are even someone we would talk about. So he was born in 1933 in England, but his parents were actually Russian aristocrats who fled the revolution there. Not together. They actually met in England, but both of their families had escaped. And his mother's life, she was actually a princess, Princess Sophia. She has written an autobiography, or she had written an autobiography, and Peter Zinovieff's daughter also wrote a book about her. So she's a really fascinating person. And she almost lived like 9 lives. She was, captured by the Nazis in Paris and was there for several years, but did survive and helped a lot of Jewish people escape. So she's got a lot of awards from the Queen for the work that she did during that time. But she just, she was a really interesting person. We could do like a whole separate podcast series on these people's lives and like where they come from and,
definitely
their family backgrounds and stuff. But that just kind of gives you a sense of, his parents and the influence they may have had on him in terms of where they come from. His father was an engineer, but lost his job during the Great Depression, and his parents got divorced. And I believe he was raised by his grandparents and a little by his father. So he wasn't really, from what I can tell, raised by his mother at all. So that's a little bit of what I've gleaned from, researching his background. He did go to Oxford, and he studied
Geology. I believe he achieved his doctorate.
Yes, his doctorate in geology. So,
and that actually informed a lot of his later work. So he, and it seems as though, based off of some of the material that we've read and studied, that it influenced a lot of his computer sequencing programs and things too.
Oh yes, the way that he was understanding geology was he was seeing those same patterns in computing technology and in music and in writing. So that's something interesting that he uniquely tied together through his life and his studies and kind of promotes this idea of, the natural elements having similar, patterns to what we would see in computers. And I think, we talk about that.
He references bits of geometry and slicing things in half and shapes. And, that seems to play a pretty big role in the way that he was going about his voltage-controlled sequencing.
Yeah, because he actually did all of these studies before he got into music and electronic music and synthesizers. He was interested in electronics as a boy. It says it was sort of like more of a hobby for him. And, studying geology, I'm not really sure exactly why he chose that path specifically. But he does seem like just a very curious person.
Yeah.
So,
he never talks about it. I've never heard anything about the origin of that.
Yeah, mostly what we've been studying is, who he is as a person and what made him interested in these ideas. We kind of know what the ideas are. We know what the sort of legacy he's left is, but we're still trying to piece together, what makes him tick and what makes him want to innovate in these ways. And that's kind of hard to, we've figured out in a lot of the videos we watched and articles we've been reading, he's kind of an unknowable creature.
I think that actually goes into his decision to be a geologist. How many geologists do you know? You know, it's kind of a unique field, especially if you're somebody who has the other interests that he had, like, you know, music and such. You know, you wouldn't. That's very left field for him to choose that.
I think it really
path.
proves like what an interesting, unique mind he has, and probably just the stew of influences he had growing up. You know, one of the most pivotal things about his early life is that he did marry a very wealthy woman, and it afforded him to not have to work. So after spending time in this remote island in Scotland doing his doctoral thesis on geology, which is a whole, you know, chapter of his life we could cover on its own, he didn't have to work.
For all of us creative types, that's like
doesn't that sound...
step one, check.
Check. Find
Money,
a rich wife.
taken care of.
So I think that those elements, you know, that foundation is why we have EMS. You wouldn't have it without those elements. I'm curious what his life would have been without those things, right?
I mean,
would we have...
We might as well mention the fact that he sold her tiara.
Yes.
To get the computer.
The family jewels. He had to sell the family jewels in order to build his first computer. So I guess, you know, that's, you know, basic biographical information about him. You know, his grandmother was also very interesting, one of the first women to fly first female bomber pilot. That's a fact that I got from, you can fact check that, in 1913. So he comes from a long line of really bold women, I would say.
Yeah.
Which I'm, you know, very fascinated by. But why are we talking about him? Because he was the first human to have a computer in his home in the early 60s. Mm-hmm. I think that's, you know, something he brings up a lot.
He's very prideful about that information, and I respect it.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably because he was experiencing a lot of, you know, rejection around that at the time, I'm sure. Like, to even be able to get it, you know, it was so expensive. It was only something that was in like factories or labs and universities and things like that. He was, you know, the first commercial home computer is something he had. And
he probably had to convince them to sell it to him. I would say that they probably didn't even really have, you know, an individual. Yeah,
I would imagine he probably had to build it, you know,
client, right?
To spec for himself. He did say that the company he bought it from was based in America, and that he had to take a course when he bought it from them in order to understand what to even do with it, because he had very specific ideas about how he wanted to use it for music, and that's not what it was intended for. So he took a course, and he said he learned one piece of code by the end of it, because he had a specific thing he wanted to do, and they gave him that specific command, and he said that's all he needed from there.
He wanted to voltage control an oscillator. Go figure.
So that is, you know, how things got started. That's the big turning point, was him, you know, selling the family jewels, getting this computer, and learning this one piece of code in order to voltage control an oscillator. From there, I'd say enter David Cockerell.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly where I was going to. He got overwhelmed pretty easily, I think it says, in terms of his own knowledge, you know, in engineering and coding. You know, so he enlisted David Cockerell, who I believe is going to go down in the history books as being one of the best and most
this is like important, influential
electronic music instrument designers of all time. You know, because he not only did EMS but went on to lead, you know, an illustrious career working for Akai, and you know, kind of developing sampling there. And he's a maverick for sure. And we should really cover him, honestly, separately. I think he's worth a segment of his own.
Yeah, he surely had his own career that we would totally, cross section with everything we talk about in the group. And the way he, is important in this conversation is, any idea that Peter Zinovieff had, David Cockerell had to bring that to life. So,
and he had a 100% success rate, according to Peter.
So every idea that Peter had, David was able to, make it real, make it a reality for him. So it's really that team. And Peter said in an interview we were watching that everyone needs a David Cockerell. And we can definitely agree with that.
Yeah. It becomes apparent that Peter was sort of the ideas guy in the team of him and David.
He's definitely a visionary.
The team of Steve Jobs and the Wozniak kind of come to mind yes. When I think about their relationship. So, I do agree with him. Everybody does need a David Cockerell.
Yeah, so without David Cockerell, there really wouldn't be, much to say about Peter Zinovieff. He would probably just be a geologist who bought a computer. But because of David Cockerell, we have EMS, and we have the Synthy, and we have the VCS3, and on and on and on and on.
Starting in November of 1969, which was long before, or I don't know how much long before, but it was definitely before Moog, and he makes that extremely clear in pretty much any interview or article I've read.
Yeah, we've brought this up a lot in past conversations we've had where, we're following the trajectory of one person at a time, but they're always in parallel with the other people of the time. And there was obviously no internet. There was very slow news, right? So they didn't know what the other people were doing. But we have, people at Bell Labs. We have Stockhausen. We have the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, obviously. But, the people who are innovating in computer music, right? It's all happening kind of at the same time. People are innovating in, early analog synthesis. Moog and Buchla and ARP, they're all happening at the same time. This very brief window, right around 69. All four of them, those are the major synthesizer companies. And
when they learned of each other, they must have thought, like, is this guy copying me?
Yeah, I think they really did, because there was no way to know, how is it that all of these ideas are happening at the same time? And I've heard, many people talk about how history kind of has this theme. I think even mathematics, geometry, things were developing at the Physics, same time and different places in the world, and they couldn't have possibly known that the other person was doing it at the same time. So synthesizers, no different. So I just found it interesting that, our favorite synthesizer companies, this early movement that we love to cover, they were all building and innovating off of very similar ideas at the same time, although they would all say they were all doing very different things and had very different approaches. But unless you dig deep, it's kind of hard to tell that. On the surface, it's all just kind of exciting to us, and we just want to fiddle with the knobs, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it does. I mean, I would say, at least from an engineering standpoint, if you look at schematics, a lot of the stuff is very different. So it's very clear that they weren't
lift the lid.
Lift the lid, and they are definitely not copying from one another in those early circuits.
But it's interesting to think about too the music that was happening at the time, and so obviously this was a push to guitar-focused bands that were maybe getting interested in innovating with their instruments. And they were introducing the synthesizer into that world. And that's what made it so commercial.
Well, and it played an integral role in the whole point of EMS Studios, which was to further Peter's explorations with the computer. So he openly admits that, every time somebody like Pink Floyd or The Who bought a bunch of his gear, he got to continue his research. So it was almost a one-to-one relationship. The money that he was bringing in from the actual gear that he was selling to musicians, with his research.
Yeah, he talked about how he put an ad in the newspaper to get funding for the computer music studio, and just he purely wanted experimentation to happen there. He did not want to be a commercial studio. He didn't want to make commercial music. He didn't want to make music for, sound effects, all the things that were happening at the radio stations or the other studios in Europe. He purely wanted to be able to explore the ideas in his mind and experiment with the equipment and have it be, for experimenting's sake, right?
Yeah, I mean, he more or less just wanted to talk to the computer and have it talk back.
Yeah, he's definitely got a lot of futuristic ideas, and I imagine having to learn what the technology was at the time and dealing with, limited storage space and all these things must have felt really frustrating for someone who could see the future of computers.
Well, he kind of admitted to not liking the instruments that his company was putting out.
Yes, that's true. So
he didn't even like the Synthy.
Something that we learned kind of early in this month's research was, we come at this from, EMS, the synthesizers, that, cool studio they had in London in the 60s and 70s, all the cool rock bands that stopped by. But then we find out that he actually hated the synthesizers. He didn't even use them. He doesn't know how they work. He doesn't want to fiddle with the pins. It was just a means to an end. It was a miniature version of what was going on in his studio, and he, wanted it to be commercially available to fund his continued research, which, is a very common approach that people will take,
Right.
The money's got to come from somewhere. Those computers are not cheap.
Exactly.
So that kind of shocked me to find out that the person that I associate the most with some of my favorite synthesizers doesn't want to even touch them.
Right.
Or mess around with them at all.
Or wasn't even really proud of the accomplishment.
Right. So that's really shifted my thinking about who Peter Zinovieff is and, what his legacy is and how I even think about him anymore. So I guess I more think about now, David Cockerell's the reason we have, Dark Side of the Moon, basically.
Yeah, he was designing, it seems, everything up until around 1975. Then some other people came into the picture. For example, Tim Orr is the guy responsible for the vocoder.
Yeah, that was another big one.
Mm-hmm. The Studio Vocoder 5000, which is an insanely big desktop unit that I've seen. Kraftwerk uses that one. Stevie Wonder, I think, was a big user as well.
I heard Peter say that at one point his computer music studio was like a giant vocoder. Just like the room was a vocoder. Yeah.
That was an early technology that I think that, David Cockerell probably helped, despite the fact that he didn't design the actual vocoder. I think he was involved with helping Peter come up with the concept of what might be possible with that technology.
Interesting. Yes, because there was someone, and I didn't write down who it was, but someone said they walked in to Peter's studio to kind of check it out. Because it was sort of the thing at the time when he first got started. It was like people were stopping by, right, to check it out. And he said he walked in and Peter was literally talking to his computer and trying to get it to talk back to him. So it makes sense that would be such a big part.
I've been there before.
Yeah. Who hasn't? Who hasn't? I guess just to wind back just a little bit, the reason for his interest in building this sequencer on a computer, through the computer, was because Daphne Oram had taught him how to make electronic music with tape. And he rejected it right out. This is, too time consuming, too fiddly. Why would I do this? It just didn't click for him. So that's kind of where we were like, okay, is he still considered someone that would fall under the Cosmic Tape Music Club umbrella?
Yes, and because I think that the criteria really is that it's people that have strong feelings about tape in the tape process. He is an example of somebody who had strong feelings in the negative department. We'll also cover people that have strong feelings in the positive.
Well, to speak of that, he actually, obviously Daphne came by, he worked with her a little bit, figured out he hated tape, and then ended up, both Delia Derbyshire and Brian Hodgson from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop left the Radiophonic Workshop and worked with Peter as Unit Delta Plus because they thought, okay, here's what we'll do. We're going to make commercial music, commercial sounds, and that's how we're going to fund the studio. They thought they were going to make just bazillions of dollars doing this computerized version of what had been, going on at the Radiophonic Workshop. And I believe they made one piece. They got one commission.
For Philips, he said, yeah.
They made one. He said something like, we made a sound. It was like whoosh or something.
Yeah.
He's like, we did that. And it made us tons of money. But again, that's really not who those people were. That's not what they cared about, and that's not why they were making electronic music. And so it quickly fell apart.
And he said that, they went on to do it, and they weren't that successful either.
Yeah,
which I thought was pretty funny.
We kind of know their stories. But Delia is someone who loved working with tape and did not want to work with computers or sequencers, and just didn't understand why anybody was interested in that.
It makes sense that they would not jive.
Collided, at one point they did work together. Their worlds collided, and that must have been a really interesting room to be in.
Yeah.
To be a fly on that wall. They did do the first, would they call it the first electronic music concert or the first computer music concert?
I would say computer music.
Yeah. So the Unit Delta Plus people put on,
one show. He was a big one-off guy. Now that I'm thinking about it.
He's like, I'll try that. No, that's not for me.
He was a big one-off person.
Yeah, they only lasted about a year, but they did this concert, and you may have seen the clips from this, because there's actually really good footage from this concert and from a lot of the things that he was doing at the time. And it went over, as you would expect, very poorly. But it was, I think a success in terms of what they were trying to achieve, which was turn the computer on, leave the stage, and have it create music that would be different every time based on, the input. It's always going to be random.
Yeah, and like most electronic music concerts and setups, it probably took them all day to set it up.
Days. I mean, they had to load everything from his studio.
Well, I'm just talking about even getting it on stage and getting it set up.
It took several young boys.
Forever.
There's footage of that too, actually.
And they probably just did a little...
Well, it was a whole... I actually don't know how long it went on, but I can imagine being in that crowd and expecting something just spectacular and groundbreaking to happen.
Yeah.
It was a sold-out crowd. I'm sure it was marketed super well.
Like robots better fly out of this machine.
And then instead it was just a tower on a stage. Delia came up, turned it on, left the stage. No one talked. Nothing visual happened. There's no liquid light show.
No recordings
it's not trippy.
were made.
No recordings were made.
Which is the real bummer.
Yeah, that would have been... There's a little video footage, but an audio recording would have been...
I've been looking for Unit Delta Plus audio for pretty much, it feels like my entire life, and it doesn't exist. Not that I know of.
Yeah, I used to think it was because they were like intentionally secretive, but then I realized it's because they didn't...
The project didn't make it to that level.
They did that one sound for Philips, and they did this one concert, and I believe that was it. I'm sure they spent a lot of time arguing about... the process. But, it was groundbreaking. You can't fault Peter Zinovieff for not being, the first at most things he was trying to do. Whether or not anybody cared or understood at the time, what impact it made. He was on his own path. I'd say that's very similar to many of the people we've talked about, like Stockhausen or Xenakis. They were in their own world. They had their own ideas about things, and they had to push against the establishment or even other people who were also innovating at the time, who just flat out rejected it or didn't want to finance it anymore. It was a real uphill battle. And to stay so committed to your own vision is something I've seen as a theme with a lot of these innovators that we cover. And I always love getting to talk about them because it gets me so jazzed and reminds me that, the unique ideas we have as artists and innovators is something to really lean into, even when you feel really alone.
Yeah, you just have to keep showing up. And, all the people that we talk about have been the ones that have kept showing up. Yeah,
not all of them lived glamorous lives. Not all of them were received well in their time. Or, even some of them died very poor and forgotten. But they stayed true to what they were about and what they were seeking and trying to make happen. And we are benefiting from them doing that. So
yeah, it definitely wasn't a scene of sellouts.
Yes, that's another thing. In one of his more recent interviews, he just talks about how even the ideas that he's working with today, still he has absolutely no interest in their commercial or popular success or influence, you know? Mm-hmm. It's experimentation for experimentation's sake. It's art for art's sake. You know, he's never going to be swayed by that. Can we, you know, just say that that comes from a place of privilege? Yes, we can say that. That is also true. But, you know, that doesn't take away from his innovations. It's just part of his specific story that he didn't have to work. Mm-hmm. So we won't hold that against him.
Certainly not.
Another fun thing about this same time is, you know, like all the rock stars were coming by, you know, to check out the studio. And of course, Sir Paul McCartney was among them. He had visited Daphne's studio as well, and she didn't know who he was.
I love that.
He visited Peter's studio, and just like Stockhausen, Peter was not interested in him or his popular music and just totally wrote him off and like barely gave him the time of day. And I was just like, oh, Paul, you're always getting snubbed by the people that like you reference as your biggest influences. They really thought so little of you. And I was just like, oh, poor Paul, always getting snubbed. But there he was. He was right in the middle of it.
Wait, isn't Paul dead?
Oh boy. That, you know, that is
the
still,
real
still
Paul,
debated to
is.
this day. So was it the real Paul or the fake Paul that went to see Peter Zinovieff and got snubbed? We'll never know. Right. Actually, I don't know the year when everyone says he died, so I could probably look that up and see. But Unit Delta Plus and the Beatles did this event called Carnival of Lights in '69 that was like a liquid light show psychedelic carnival experience. And the Beatles specifically made music for this event that no one has ever heard. It wasn't recorded. And I am obsessed with this, that this happened. It's like a Grateful Dead acid test kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, we have got to find this. There's got to be somebody alive who was there and who can tell us about it. Because no one talks about it. I find these links and they're dead. They don't go anywhere. And I can't find anybody who knows about this. So this is my plea. I want to know about the Carnival of Lights. I want to know who knows about it, who was there. I want to know what that experience was like and what that music was like. And
maybe if you had a little portable tape recorder.
Yeah, I mean.
That would have been amazing.
There's got to be something. There's got to be something more we can find out. There's a copy of The Flyer, which is, you know, very psychedelic and of the time. So I'm just curious, was Delia, you know, making tape loops while Paul was fiddling with I don't think they had built any synths yet. So what were they doing? Was the computer talking to them? You know,
I mean, I think that
what was this show like?
Voltage controlled oscillators were happening. You know, yeah. I think that, you know, synthesizers were maybe not formally called synthesizers, but they were definitely in the picture. You know, like lab equipment has been around for a very, very long time and a lot longer than synthesizers.
Yeah, I mean, his studio was built on test equipment.
Sure.
Mostly. And then, you know, from there, getting the computer and then whatever David Cockerell was building for him.
They had some noisemakers, for sure.
Yeah, some tone generators. So, yeah, that's my dream. If I could get in a time machine and go to that festival, I
want to be.
That's what I want to do.
I want to be at the Unit Delta Plus show.
Well, that's what that would have been. I think. You mean the one at the
concert?
Hall. Yeah. That would have been fine, but I'm talking a psychedelic carnival.
Both. You know me, I'm a both guy.
I want to be at that. I guess it's because we have footage of that other concert, so I'm like, I feel like I was there.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad that was sufficient for you.
Oh, here's another fun thing I found out. In 1968, Peter Zinovieff submitted a computer music generated composition called ZASP to the IFIP, which I believe is like the International Federation of Information Processing. The International Federation for Information Processing held
That's a mouthful.
Held a composition competition as part of it, and Peter Zinovieff's piece ZASP with Alan Sutcliffe. I always want to give credit as much as I can to everybody else who was involved. They came in second. And who came in first? Xenakis. The meeting of the minds. It was happening everywhere, whether they knew it or not. I don't know if they knew each other or they interacted at all.
Well, I certainly believe that fact.
But they both submitted to this and came in first and second. So I'd always love when I find those threads that they share in common.
So
that was like that time period. This is like 68, 69. Everything we've just been talking about is all from 68, 69.
Are we ready for a little tech break?
I think we are. I think it's time to talk about how they kept things going. So now we're in the era of EMS, Electronic Music Studios. And they had a little storefront in London to sell these synthesizers. So I guess you could come in and see them and then buy them.
And
tell me all about what these synthesizers were.
Well, I'm really just going to talk about the Putney.
Okay.
In 1969, the Putney was released, and it's a 3-oscillator synthesizer. It is called formally the Voltage Control Studio.
That's what VCS stands for.
That's where the VCS comes into play. And 3 oscillators.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Sounds like a band, the Voltage Controlled Studio 3.
Yeah.
So I could see why they didn't call it that.
I would buy that band's tape.
For sure. Side project. And then also the DK1 keyboard, nicknamed the Cricklewood, which was
the Cricklewood?
Which is
this is the first time hearing this. What is that?
That's apparently where David Cockerell, where his studio was, where his actual like in-home studio was. That's where he was operating. And the Putney is where Peter was living at the time in London.
Wow.
So if you're familiar with those areas, this is, not strange knowledge whatsoever.
Not at all.
But
I apologize for being alarmed by the word Cricklewood. It just it's such a fun word to say. Crickle, crickle, crickle.
But
it's very ASMR.
The Cricklewood was a velocity sensitive, which I actually did a double take on this when I first
That's right.
learned
You didn't
that.
believe me when I told you.
I did not, because I just hadn't heard that term associated with an analog device. But it was, in fact, velocity sensitive, and it had its own oscillator and the ability to trigger, envelopes and things from the VCS3. And you could play it if you turned the oscillator tracking all the way up. It would track 1-to-1, so you could actually play a melodic piece with the keyboard itself. Probably more accurately. I mean, actually, certainly more accurately than the original design of the VCS3. So it's been, it's something that can now be modified to be a lot more stable. But the initial version was almost thought of as like a sound effects device, because it had mic and instrument inputs and a spring reverb and speakers and a joystick, so like everything sort of pointed towards this idea of like, plug things into it and like move the joystick around and it'll make, these wild sounds, and it wasn't really until the keyboard was also introduced that people started seeing it as something that they may be able to play melodic material with.
So you're saying that the VCS3 didn't have a keyboard at first? Or are you saying that when they made the VCS3, which
the VCS3 does not have a keyboard, period.
Gotcha. When they added it.
Yes.
I think I'm mixing up all of my synthes now. I'm going to throw some links into
so the VCS3 is the wooden box.
Right. I know what the VCS3 is.
Yeah, with the joystick.
I'm going to throw some links in here so you guys can see what we're talking about and kind of follow along a little bit.
So I'm just going to briefly go over the architecture while she's doing that. 3 voltage control oscillators. The third one does not really go into the audio range, so it was used more of a control. It was just a very low frequency oscillator that was used more for control purposes. That can now be, added like a high or low range to it, so you can use it for both. But The filter is a very unique design. A lot of people thought that it was a 12 decibel per octave cutoff, or an 18 decibels per octave cutoff. But it is neither a 12 or an 18. It does both. It has different stages. And when the resonance is turned all the way up, the low frequencies actually get cut and reduced to the point to where they consider it a bandpass filter as well. So very unique filter architecture. It's so refreshing that it's not anything like the 24 decibel per octave filter that Moog designed that's extremely famous. And so it has its own sound. If you would like to hear examples of it, I don't know, what are some of your favorite pieces? I really like the soundtrack to Dark Star.
Yes, we did. This Friday, our retro sci-fi film for the week was Dark Star, inspired by, our coverage of Peter Zinovieff this month in the group. And, in an interview I read with John Carpenter, he talks about how there was this one dude in the San Fernando Valley who had this rad synth that he had never seen before. Nobody else had this. And so he went over there for 4 hours and he did the score for Dark Star. And the way he described it, he talked about pins. You had to put all these pins in. And, just the timing and the way he described it, we know now it was the VCS-3. So the tie-in with retro sci-fi movies and soundtracks and sound design and, and synthesizers, there's no end to these threads. I keep finding them everywhere I look.
Yeah, you can barely find anything where, John Carpenter admits or talks about it being the VCS-3. So he did not care what it was.
No, he didn't care. It was just that
so happens.
It did what he wanted it to do.
Yeah.
And he did say, it can't be recreated. Whatever he did in that time was what it was. I don't know what he recorded it to, but we do know that Peter Zinovieff's studio did have, reel-to-reel and tape machines galore that were in the mix as well.
Yeah, it seemed to have quite a few.
Yeah, you couldn't avoid that at the time, obviously.
The Radiophonic Workshop definitely had a VCS-3, although I would say that a lot of its most, the better-known works were done before they received that.
Yeah, he did talk about how, he gets kind of lumped in with the Radiophonic Workshop a lot, but he didn't work there or do any work for them. It's just they bought...
Or even outfit their initial...
He bought their synthesizers. They bought his...
Yes.
What did I just say? They bought his synthesizers.
Yeah.
And he's just like, yeah, they had my stuff. That's kind of the end of it. And he, obviously worked with Delia and Brian, but...
They bought the Synthy 100, which was a massive, tabletop unit. I mean, it was a piece of furniture in itself.
Let me find a good photo of the Synthy 100.
The Delaware. And
everything has two names, just to keep us as confused as possible.
That one didn't arrive until 1971. So it was actually the first thing they made, I think, after the VCS-3.
They were really pumping them out.
Was this monstrous thing. It doesn't surprise me at all that, that Peter would want to design a monstrous thing that took up an entire room, because that seemed to be his vibe. But yeah, it's just a massive version, I would say, of the Synthy architecture. It had a sequencer built in.
It was like 3 Synths.
It was like 3 Synths. It had an oscilloscope, so you could see, directly on it. It basically just, was the Synthy on steroids, I would say. A lot of them.
Yeah, so it seems like they found, the Synthy A was the first thing, and the VCS-3 was the first, and it was so popular. Thousands were sold, right?
Yeah.
And so from that, it allowed them to keep creating more and more and more. So it was like this short period of time where they were creating a lot, and then it just kind of died.
Also very Zinovieff-like.
Yeah. I think, it's a sad story.
Burn bright.
Of what, happened to EMS and why it wasn't able to, continue to thrive. And there's some parallels with ARP as well. Similar kind of Just
Oh, you're talking about the fact that the Synthy Hi-Fly,
yes,
which was a
their downfall.
guitar-intended product that I still to this day don't really understand how it works. I'm not going to go into detail about that one.
I'm going to try to find that as well.
I know what it looks like. I've seen them around, but like apparently, you plug the guitar in and it's got some synth features to it. It maybe tracks the pitch of the guitar and out comes a synthesizer. So it just seems like, they were, trying to make something that the guitarist that sort of ruled the commercial market for music instruments at the time and almost to this day, right?
Yeah. Guitarists rule the world.
That they can put something in the guitarist's hands that they can do a lot of the same things that they might do with the Synthy. So apparently it didn't go well, much like the ARP situation, which we won't go into detail about, but.
Yeah, that's for another conversation, but they just have so much parallel in that they tried to expand to these other markets. They relied on some funding that maybe wasn't really there, and it just collapsed because they put a lot of money into R&D for something that didn't sell. And you just need one thing like that when you're a small company to go poorly. And, that was the end of that. I found this really cool the re-release of the Synthy Hi-Fly from Digitana Electronics, and they show the version they're making, but then if you scroll down a little bit, you can see the original version from 1972.
Digitana, for those that aren't in the know, is a super cool company that puts out like a lot of complementary devices to use with newer, older EMS hardware, and so it makes sense that they might reissue something like this, and I'm sure that it's very cool. And
it's really interesting, too, for them to re-release the thing that brought about the downfall of EMS. And I'm curious, how well that's going for them.
Well,
sort of like, don't touch the cursed stone,
Right, but I think that, it makes sense that it would be even more popular in today's market.
Now, yeah. It's interesting, right? Because after EMS kind of folded, Peter didn't really do anything in music again until 2007, I think, is when he kind of got, somebody reached out to him again because of this resurgence that we're having.
He took a geology break.
Yeah, he took a geology break to make music, and then he took a music break to do geology. I don't know what he was doing, to be honest. It's the dark years. Somebody in the group might know, though. But EMS did change hands, and it does still exist. So they sold it to, a hospital bed company, I want to say.
You got me on that one.
And obviously things didn't go well. And then they sold it again, and now, Robin Wood was able to buy it.
So Robin Wood is somebody who started off as a technician, probably an assistant to David.
Yeah, he consistently worked for EMS his whole life.
Yeah, and so he, eventually was able to strike a deal and take over the company, and now builds Synths. They do Synthy A. They do not do them in the original case because apparently the Spartanite cases are no longer being made or manufactured or can be found, really. So if you find one used, you can actually still get him to put the Synthy A in it, but he does not supply the cases any longer. He also does the VCS3 and the Cricklewood, the keyboard, and I think that's it. But, we're actually on the list. I've heard that it takes 10 years or more for your name to come up because they only pump out a few units a year. So, that'll give us some time to earn the money to afford it.
Yeah. That, every year when we get the update of where we are on the list, I'm like, phew, still 10 years to go.
So am I.
We've still got time. But yeah, owning that original design is something we care about. And we know there's a lot of, clone options that are great, and I'm glad they exist. But some things, you want a classic car, you're not going to get like the new Beetle if you like the original Beetle.
Right.
But that's a debate that we have all the time in this group. And we love a positive, rousing debate about, clones versus originals versus analog versus digital versus using the app, all that kind of stuff. I think I'm just happy to be in a time when all of those things are available. So if I'm on the road and I have an iPad, I can still do it. Or if I'm at home in my studio, I can use the real thing, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, speaking of which, there is iVCS3, which is a iOS app that is really awesome, honestly. Like, if you're looking to, that's another reason why I can't see myself, getting one of the other clones, is that I can, if I'm really jonesing, so to speak, of, to mess around with the synthy, I have that ability in my phone, and it actually probably behaves a lot more predictably, which is both the charm and, the detriment of it. But
so I know we posted about this already, but I'm going to put a little YouTube video, which I haven't fully vetted, so it might be terrible, but it's about the iVCS3. So that's going into the comments as well. Okay. We were getting really technical and nerdy about everything, and then I kind of cut you off. We always are veering all over the place.
I was sort
it's
of
a cosmic conversation. We never know where it's going to go.
I was sort of expecting there to be sort of just this natural cut off with it, like there's only so much tech time allotted me. So
you can have more. There's so much more. They did so much cool stuff. I think the Spectron video synth is something that I want to research more. Again, we're in the middle of the month, right? So we still have time to, review this conversation, review more articles, find more videos, get deeper on the stuff that we're just starting to learn about for having this conversation. So I'm excited to spend a little more time.
I bet you Peter would say that the Spectron video synth was the very first video synth.
He probably would. I think he actually was the first person to have a screen in the mix with his computer set up. Nobody was doing anything with a screen.
Yeah, whereas we know that there are other video synths that might have been percolating around 1974, which is when the Spectron, I don't think it was ever released, but when it was made, at least.
Wasn't released, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think he just made it for himself.
Yeah, we know that FC Judd, which is somebody that we'll definitely talk about, he made a version of a video synthesizer.
Yeah, that thing's really cool.
That one I think was analog though.
Yeah, this is, it's interesting because if I just look up the Spectron, it takes me to the Wikipedia page for video synthesizer in general. And then I guess within that is the history of the EMS Spectron.
I did check that out.
Yes,
yeah.
It was for Richard Monkhouse developed a hybrid video synthesizer, and it used the EMS patchboard system. It says here to allow completely flexible connections between module inputs and outputs. The video signals were digital, but they were controlled by analog voltages. And there was a digital patchboard for image composition and an analog patchboard for motion control. And here, there's a little image here that was created by...
That looks very LZX.
Yeah, so I think it looks like it was handmade with paper. Looks like a paper cutout. This is crazy. I'm going to try to link this image.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool image.
Let's see if that comes through. Bloop. Nope, it's just going to take you to the Wikipedia page. But you'll see it there if you jump down to the Spectron. That's very cool to be able to see. I wish I could share the screen with you guys so you could see this image, because it's exactly the kind of minimalist early video synth stuff that I really love. Because I love having that, I'm not anti-digital. I love analog being in the mix, though. The randomness, the sort of primitive nature. There's something about it that I really connect with and makes me more excited than something that is perfect or a perfect mathematical equation.
Yeah.
That doesn't excite me as much.
And the ones that are around today, we've built a very meager LZX DIY system.
Yes, that's kind of on pause right now. I'm excited to get back to that.
We're close to being done with it, though, and it's just so darn simple, and it feels a lot like a primitive analog synthesizer, like an MS-10, a Korg MS-10 or something like that, but visual. And it's just the simplicity of it, the fact that you can just make some like basic shapes and patterns and things, I think is the charm for me, because it seems like something that would be infused in some of the like psychedelic, video work of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, speaking of sort of primitive or, randomness, I'd love to touch on a little anecdote that we learned about how Peter was really interested in randomness. He didn't want to, put an equation in and have it spit something out.
That is a very common thread, I would say, amongst the people that we cover here in the Cosmic Tape Music Club. Many of the people that we've covered so far have an obsession for randomness. So that is sort of the ultimate goal to achieve, I would say, with electronic music, would be something that, resembles true random behavior.
And maybe you can explain how he was doing that?
So his earliest example, which he said that was happening like pretty much right away, like before they even designed the Synthy, is that he had a Geiger counter connected to the computer, and it was measuring the radioactivity of the computer itself and generating random sets of numbers. So there was no algorithm involved. It was literally sampling from the actual radioactive activity of the machine to then control oscillators and other things to, and he said that it did a very, very good job of doing pure random. So it makes sense to me because, that voltage is going to be constantly fluctuating.
Yeah, just a steady stream of random numbers, never repeated, no sequence, just on and on, endless information to create the randomness. And so I always find that so interesting because it's like, okay, so the point is that you wanted to take this sort of painful tape splicing process and make it more automated. That was really the point. He saw how processes were being done with computers in factories. Turn this on, turn this off, send this down the line. And he wanted to do that with tape music, basically. He didn't want to get his hands dirty. I always think of him as like this aristocrat who's like can't be bothered with the tape and the splicing and, the manual labor of it all.
The pin patching.
Yeah.
But then it's funny because it's going back to the pin patching. He made a comment that in one of the things that we actually watched, where he was like, "Well, at least it wasn't, leads." So he thought cables were even worse. It's like, well, at least our synthesizer had a patch bay with pins, and it didn't have these messy cables everywhere, because that is the worst thing.
I don't think many of us would disagree with that to an extent.
I love him.
I get where he's coming from. But this kind of leads into, his ultimate invention was that he wanted an implant in his arm muscle. And he designed it with David Cockerell. They actually figured out how to design an implant. Look, we're both like, no.
Yeah, I'm rubbing my arm like,
don't implant me. But he wanted an implant that would then generate, I guess he would think high note, and this implant would then talk to the computer and it would generate the high note.
It would generate a high note. And once again, David Cockerell's batting 1,000.
Yeah.
He designs the thing. And the only thing that stops him from being able to put this in his arm is finding a physician that would do it.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's pretty amazing. I think that, he's also the godfather of the movement that, now people are doing things to themselves, right? Biohacking.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But he was doing it because he didn't want to, he wanted to automate or take away any resistance between his thoughts and the ability to make that happen through the computer.
Another very common thread amongst these electronic music instrument designers is the idea of, taking out the resistance or the go-between between like our minds and our ability to control things. So we've seen that time and time again. People just want to be able to fluidly control devices with their bodies and minds.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uninhibited.
It makes sense to me because
Yeah.
if you think about the fact that, if he's really working with computers to this level and you understand that your brain is like a computer, I can imagine the frustration when you hit that wall of like, oh, I can't break through this man-machine problem conversation, right? Then the other part of me thinks, why do we want machines to be man and why do we want man to be machine? Like, I'm still grappling with that when we're always trying to infuse humanity into the machine. We want the randomness. We don't want it to be perfect. We don't want it to be a machine. We want it to take care of some automation stuff for us, but we still want it to be empathetic or understand beauty.
Yeah. I mean,
or surprise us. I guess we want it to surprise us.
As creators, we usually gravitate toward creating things in our own image.
Yes, I would say this man-machine conversation is a lot of, who is God? Are we God?
Of our own little universes, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that's a rhetorical question, but I think that's the question at the heart of this. Yes. And music is sort of the language with which we're expressing this desire. This is getting very heady now.
You took it there.
I know. I'm always going to make things a little cosmic,
but
a little
he
psychedelic.
Took it there a lot.
That's true. I mean, this is the way he thinks. So
this is the spirit of Peter.
He's not as interested in being sort of like I'm a computer music innovator as he is wanting to create experiences where we're interfacing with technology and with computers in a way that creates art and helps us think deeply about things. So he's a very complicated person, and in all of the readings that we've done and interviews we've watched, he's still such an enigma to me. I still don't quite understand all of these things, these things that don't seem like they belong in someone's brain together. Geology and crystal formations and computer music and wanting to put an implant in yourself. How is this all in one person?
He seemed to always be putting things in terms that when he, spoke about the things that he was excited about, he seemed to really keep it high level. Right. And
yes, he didn't get his hands dirty with the details.
But I think that he did that on purpose because, he knows, I think he understood people well enough to know that that's not something that, everyone's going to latch onto. It's more about the thing, the high level stuff, the concepts that are, fun and exciting for people to imagine.
Yeah, it's almost like he gave people a little gift of inspiration. So he'd be like, I have this vision, and he would just talk about it in high-minded terms and hand it to someone, and then they would develop it into something.
Right. But very rarely do you hear, the super specifics and details, of the certain projects, spoken about by him, which is different, I would say, than other people that we've covered.
Yeah, he's definitely unique. As much as I've always thought of him in the same vein as everybody else we've covered, especially the BBC Radiophonic Workshop people for some reason, or, even ARP or Moog, but he's not. It's like these things have been put on his legacy, and that's not really who he is. That's not the whole picture. And so it's been really fun to learn more about all the other things he's interested in. He's in the past, I would say 10, 15 years ago, he was really ramping up some other compositional ideas he was working on with, sculptors. He's working with, symphony orchestras. He's infusing electronic and tape music into, traditional elements. I guess more of the classical arts, and he's bringing innovation and computer music and technology into those spaces and collaborating with people on these huge projects that are funded by, universities and stuff. And so the music itself is not really anything that you would want to put on a Spotify playlist. It's not really commercial consumption. It's more about the idea of whatever it is that he's working on technology-wise, and how it relates to music and then what comes out of it. It's not really as much concerned with the composition itself. Like, he worked on an opera where he wrote the libretto, which is the words in the story, and he created a new language, and these people had to sing this language he made up because he was more interested in, making a new sound. And what are those sounds? Do they still evoke the same emotion, even though they're not English words? So he just really likes to mess with people, I think, and turn your world inside out.
Do we have handy the composer that he collaborated with?
So for the, let me grab that. It was like the Mask of Orpheus. So Harrison Birtwistle.
That's
someone
the name.
he worked with a
lot. That is the name, yes.
Harrison Birtwistle wrote the opera, the music for the opera, The Mask of Orpheus, and he did the libretto. And he also did this piece, Tristan's Folly, in the opera Tristan by Hans Werner Henze. I'm not sure I'm saying that exactly correctly. Please forgive me. There was a tape by Zinovieff included in this, and that's a really interesting piece. That's actually, I might link that later this week. So it'll be interesting to pull up some of the music that I can find. It's very hard to find any recorded music by him because it was these experiences or these sound effects, right? Or was part of something larger. But thanks to everyone's friend, Pete Kember of Sonic Boom, who was also friends with Delia and tried to help bring, her legacy back to life, he also helped Peter put together a compilation of recordings he did during the EMS years, which I've also posted about in the group.
I remember when that came out. Yeah, I was really excited.
Yeah, so that was
2015.
The sort of like the EMS tapes or whatever, and it came out in 2015, I believe. And I've linked that in the group. There's not, it's not really online to listen to. You'd have to have the physical copy, but there's a couple tracks up on YouTube as well.
It's on the Spotify and Apple Music.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, so I'll try to find that as well.
Yeah, it's definitely there.
On Spotify.
I used to listen to that while I was working at my previous job. It was kind of like my whistle while you work music. And
interesting.
My coworkers thought that I was extremely strange for listening to it, because when you listen to it, you'll know what just imagine.
Yes, it's called Electronic Calendar. Sorry, I forgot.
Imagine listening to this body of work like in a place where, people are listening to top 40.
Like 2020 is top 40. I don't even know what that is.
Right. And
like, hey guys, you want to hear this collection of sound effects from 1969?
Yeah, and I'm listening to like the weirdest, hissiest,
Yeah, this is definitely some experimental stuff. So here's the Spotify link to that album, which is again just a compilation. It's called Electronic Calendar, the EMS tapes, and it was curated by Pete Kember. 2 hours of random stuff.
Brother Pete.
It's real random. The most recent, it actually came out last year, is a work he did with a cellist named Lucy Railton. And I think this was something that they did for a live, again, an installation or a live performance.
A one-off.
And then somebody was able to release it, last year. And it's Inventions for Cello and Computer. And so I think we'll be doing a blog post of some of the music, so you can spend some time hearing the kind of work that he was creating. And again, we don't really know where his music side comes from. It just says he was always interested in music. He was always interested in electronics, but it's not, he didn't study it. No one in the family was musical. I don't know where that comes into play. It's very fascinating to me.
I think he mentioned that he was in like a vocal project in college or something. It was in that last thing that we watched.
Yeah, but that's sort of where my research wants to continue, is how does someone who's just sort of tangentially interested in music become known for, their impact on electronic music?
By accident.
When that wasn't really the intention.